Oh, I'm calling this talk Reframing ESP, a condensed model. So for the introduction, we think of 1937, J.B. Rhine was struggling to fit the idea of precognition into extrasensory perception that at that time comprised telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. In this paper, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to fit telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis into precognition. So the strategy is to take precognition seriously and use Occam's razor to see how simple we can go in explaining how ESP works, building from ideas already published. An issue here is time, understanding time. It's much better understood now than it was in 1937. Hugh Price in 1996 talks about of the past unlocked. How do you do that? And Daniel Sheehan is running conferences on retrocausation. The quantum physicists are talking about quantum correlations with no causal order. And Dean Radin is showing that information flow in ESP tasks is from the future to the past. Consequently, precognition seems to have a real credible mechanism. On the other hand, telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis, they all have problems. Telepathy has a targeting problem and a transmission problem. The targeting problem is, how do you aim the message to the right person? Why doesn't it go to the wrong person, go to somebody else? How does it travel from you to her? What carries it there? Clairvoyance also has the same problems. How does it know where to look? And who or what carries the information flawlessly right back to you? Psychokinesis has an even bigger problem, an existential problem. It's supposed to be a force, but the character of the test results have been shown to be information-like. Therefore, it's more correctly clairvoyance. So are they all really precognition? Using Occam's razor, we would say we have to give precedence to simplicity. So let's assume that they're all precognition. So then how does that work? Well, assuming precognition is all there is, then our current explanation of telepathy must be wrong. So how do we explain telepathy by precognition? Telepathy tests allow participants to discuss the results after the tests, and that's the crux of it. From these discussions, the participants in the past get the information precognitively from the future. They record it or remember it so that they have something interesting to discuss after the tests. And the flaw in the idea of telepathy is the assumption that it was actually between people, when in reality it was one person getting a message from the future. Clairvoyance, psychokinesis, and remote viewing have the same issues. They have discussions or they see the results after the tests, and from these, they, in the past, get the information precognitively and gain a lot of satisfaction discussing it after the tests, particularly about whatever is personally meaningful to them. They've labeled them clairvoyance and remote viewing because they seem to be different. What we're saying is it's all precognition from exposure to the results after the tests. What about vast distances and into the past and on large scales? ESP experiments seem to operate over vast distances, from out in space, from deep in mines, or from under the sea. They're also claimed to operate into the past. They seem to operate at both micro scales with quantum events and at large scales like horse races or the stock exchange. But if we're going to take precognition seriously, we would just reframe all of that and say this is because the experimenters and participants learn about the results after the facts. And in the future time when they learn, that's the origin of the information that's picked up precognitively and used in the past before and during the experiments to get the results that we observe. So Occam would say it's most realistic to just interpret all of this as precognition. Another simplifying assumption is the examples above don't give us an information source. So where do we get the information from when we're using precognition? Well, again, using Occam's razor, we would choose the simplest source and propose that precognition only gets information from the future self, particularly from moments of excitement or personal interest. So here's an example. It's an example that's been in the literature for a while, but there's a train accident, many people are killed. Jane is shocked when she learns it was the train that she would have been on the day before. That shock filters back in time down her space-time world line and blocks her barely conscious routine decision to set her alarm. Consequently, she's too late for the fatal train, but she's alive to tell the story. And the point of this example is all this happened in her own mind. There was no need for any targeting or transmission field or scanning the future for train accidents or resonance or connection with other people's minds. There was just her and her precognition. Now, describing these things is not easy. It's inevitable if we accept precognition, we're going to have to talk and think differently about what's going on. I put quite a bit of thought into this, and here are just a couple of slides that are attempts to describe what happens from the perspective of this reframed model that's been outlined above. In an ESP test with random number generators, a description could be that the future effect, I've got it in inverted commas because cause and effect get muddled up here. The future effect is a randomly occurring event. It's controlled by a random number generator. The past cause, you're trying to influence it, is a randomly made decision. It's actually pretty random. But occasionally the past decision is changed by the person's precognition to align with the future randomly occurring event. And this is because the subject who's getting the information precognitively wants to believe that they're causing or predicting the future. So they change their mind. If they didn't want to, then their past decision would not be changed and the future event would still happen. The random number generator is not influenced. In the actual tests, there are many cases of both changed decisions and unchanged decisions, but every time a precognition changes a decision, it's an extra chance event and it's counted as an ESP result. Here's another way of describing it. It's a little bit simpler to access. If you know where you want to go, you wait for the right bus to come along and you jump on board. In Edwin May's words, you become a statistical opportunist by recognizing the bus you want from a random stream of buses. But note, of course, if you don't get the bus, it still goes. And in this description, there's no determinism because the subject is chosen. Now, putting all this model together, here's a description of the reframed model, and we propose that it's described like this. Personally significant information that we receive in our future stays within our future memory, which is connected by our space-time world line to our past self. And our past self detects some of that information by precognition and incorporates it into decisions being made there in the past. In fewer words, a much simpler sentence, we propose that when you're making decisions that are significant to us, we're intimately guided by information that comes exclusively from our own future selves. And that's essentially the reframed ESP model that we're talking about. But there's quite a bit more to say. There's consequences of this model, and there's 4 of those, and we've got to work through them. The first one is the experimenter effect. If we're going to take precognition seriously, we need to expect that the experimenter effect will occur. And that's some big consequences, and we'll look at a few slides over that. The experimenter effect is when the experimenter always tends to get what they want. In mainstream research, the experimenter effect is well recognized as the failure to design the experiment properly to exclude known sources of bias. But taking precognition seriously, we'd also expect that people designing and running experiments would use their own precognition to guide them to decisions that are slanted towards what they really believe or they want to believe, even if it's unconsciously. Edwin May in 2016 puts it this way. One way to think of this assertion is that precognition conceptually allows access to a future answer book in any experimental setup. This leads us to the almost completely ignored point that very few experiments take any effort to exclude precognitive information from the future. Consequently, this allows precognition to supercharge the experimenter effect. As a result of that, we conclude that no experiment can be trusted if it has failed to guard against the possibility of influence from the future by any decision maker within the overall experimental framework, and that's experimenter or subject. And this is just as relevant in mainstream science as it is in ESP research. So the implication is take precognition seriously, or else your experiments are going to give you the wrong answer. Right, well, that's the first of these consequences. The second one is related to that. The experimenter effect is going to create anomalies that aren't really there. So looking a bit more at this, experimenter created anomalies. Because the experimenter effect can be enhanced by precognition, there will inevitably some ESP claims and mainstream phenomena that are conceptualized and sustained solely by the experimenter effect, which have no real substance at all. And I've been involved in one of these myself. I examined the effect of random number generator bit rate, that's 20 bits per second to 16 million bits per second, based on some work that they had done at Princeton. And I found, to my great satisfaction, a marginal increase in effect size as the numbers of bits increased. I've tried to replicate it because I didn't get enough statistical significance there, and I've done another experiment with 800 million bits per second. And what I've found is almost emphatically that the effect has completely disappeared. So what did I do wrong? So I think it has no substance at all. It's the experimenter, that's me and the people at Princeton, who became statistical opportunists in this case by choosing the evidence that we wanted to believe both from the present as well as accessing it precognitively from the future. So experimenters, I believe, can build and sustain false anomalies that last for years as long as they continue to want them. And there are other examples of this, not just my own one. So that's two of the consequences. The third one is that if we're going to be serious about this, we need to be prepared to design experiments with more sophisticated controls to manage information from the future and exclude it from our results. And the final one is that we need to expect that cause and effect will sometimes swap their order. And this is okay if you're talking about information from the future, and in fact, it's inevitable. And I've noted at the bottom as the consequences, precognition is whispering in your ear for many of the decisions that you make in life. There's two further features that I want to mention as belonging to the model. We already know about them quite a lot, but I just want to put them in here. Psychology filters precognitive information. It's expressed and filtered by well-recognized psychological processes, and this has been described by Carpenter in his book, such things as ego, denial, projection, rationalization. All these things are going to come through in the information that we get from precognition. So, as with many other sensory inputs we have, precognitive information is going to be received largely unconsciously. It seems to contribute to decision-making by the well-recognized decision-making processes that psychologists understand. And it's used for our safety, well-being, and personal interest, as our other sensory inputs are. And if it's boring, it's ignored completely. So that's one of the things that I would add to the model. The second one is that precognition provides only sparse information. For ESP research, sparse information content's one of the most significant findings that there is, and it's not quite clear why. Efforts to amplify it have been singularly unsuccessful, and for many decades, it's just been accepted as a fact of life. As a consequence, any explanations that we have, such as this model, need to be consistent with very few successes amongst many decisions. 0.2% is a common number. Now, what does this model give us? If it's going to work, it has to give us some sort of advantage. So I've got a list here of the things that I think it solves in the ESP research area. It narrows telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis and their derivatives down to precognition only. That's the only one we're really looking at. Explains how ESP can appear to transmit to distant places or times. That's been a big problem. How does it do that? It explains how ESP appears to flawlessly find its targets. That's because the target is yourself. It narrows down the search for a transmission medium to focus on our own personal world line. And it narrows the source of precognitive information down to our own future selves, our future experiences, and our future emotions. With Carpenter, who's written the book, it embraces the influence of personal psychology on the character of the experimental results. And it explains the experimenter effect. And possibly it explains over 100 years of confusing experimental results that have actually been influenced by the experimenter effect. And it points to how we should restructure our protocols to avoid contamination from the precognition of the participants. I'll put a couple of tests here to validate this model. They take a little bit of thinking about. The hypothesis number one is that ESP tests only get significant results when there is a future revelation made. So you're going to falsify that if you want to say that I'm wrong. And if you want to embarrass me, you're going to falsify the second one as well, that precognitive process acts exclusively in the subject's own head, not exclusively or partially from outside it. So prove that one wrong, and I can be embarrassed about that. I'd like to say what this model is not. For this reframing project, the model is limited to explaining Rhine's ESP and its derivatives. There are a lot of other classes of psychic phenomena that have entirely different mechanisms, and this paper is not attempting to explain all of those. It's want to be focused on just what we're talking about. For example, the Global Consciousness Project, it's tempting to say it's the same thing, and other similar group meditation type effects. I'm saying they're quite different because they don't have any decision process going on. Another example is poltergeists. They're very different for similar reasons. They're not about information being received. They're about some sort of force that I'm not trying to explain. So in conclusion, almost all the ideas here have been in the literature for many years, and our task has been to choose what is relevant and what is not, and then to synthesize a model that we believe better matches the experimental findings. And I'd like to acknowledge the creative work that people have done, as well as the long and difficult experimental programs that have brought us the results that we draw on for things like those in this paper. Thank you very much.